The late afternoon sun filtered gently through the glass facade of the Elysian, a high-end restaurant nestled in the heart of Manhattan. The clinking of glasses, the quiet hum of conversation, and the soft notes of a grand piano created the kind of polished ambience one would expect from a Michelin-starred establishment. Waiters glided across the floor in tailored uniforms, carrying trays of oysters, truffle risottos, and rare wines. The guests were dressed impeccably, suits freshly pressed, dresses sleek and tailored, watches gleaming under golden lights. At precisely 5:45 p.m., a woman stepped into the restaurant. Her presence did not match the room. She wore a long grey wool coat, slightly frayed at the cuffs, with large buttons that had lost their shine. Her shoes were worn at the heels, and the tote bag on her shoulder sagged from years of use. Her silver hair was pulled into a low bun, strands falling loose around her face. She stood with quiet dignity, her back straight, her eyes observant. No one looked up, not at first. But as she walked past the hostess podium, a young woman in a tight black blazer blinked at her, visibly confused. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said quickly, stepping in front of her.
May I help you?
The woman offered a gentle smile. "Yes."
Y a va réservation. Under the name Margaret Hill.
The hostess froze for a moment, clearly surprised. Her perfectly shaped brows furrowed as she typed something into the screen in front of her. The moment of silence stretched. "Margaret Hill," she repeated, glancing up. "For this evening?" "Yes, at 6, Margaret said patiently. "I believe it was confirmed yesterday." The hostess gave a slight, forced smile. "Ah yes. I see it here." She hesitated for another second, as if trying to decide whether to offer a different explanation, but instead she stepped out from behind the stand and motioned with her hand. "Right this way," she said, her tone professional but clipped. Margaret followed. As they walked through the dining area, several pairs of eyes glanced over. A man in a silk shirt whispered something to his date. A group of young professionals paused their conversation to watch her pass. Their expressions were not curious, they were judgmental. "She looks like she took a wrong turn from the subway," one whispered. "Maybe she's just lost," another chuckled. The hostess led Margaret to a table tucked near the back of the restaurant, right by the service door and far from the large windows with skyline views. "Here we are," she said, setting down the menu. "Let me know if you need help navigating it. Our dishes can be complex."
Margaret sat down without a word.
She placed her tote beside her, opened the menu with calm hands, and began reading. From a few tables over, laughter broke out again. "She better check the prices before she orders," a young man snorted. "Maybe she thinks this is one of those senior meal deals," said his friend, smirking. The waitress assigned to her table did not approach right away. Instead, she served other guests nearby, casting quick glances toward Margaret. Finally, after a long delay, she came by and offered a glass of water. "Would you like some help with the menu?" she asked. "No thank you," Margaret replied. "I'm still deciding." The waitress nodded and walked away, but not before whispering something to another server as she passed. He laughed under his breath. Time moved slowly at Margaret's table. No one brought bread. No one offered wine. She sat alone, eyes moving steadily across the menu as if completely unaware of the buzz around her. But she wasn't unaware. She had felt it the moment she walked in, the shift in atmosphere, the subtle discomfort in others, the way the room had turned against her without a word. It wasn't the first time. She had lived through decades of this, dismissals, assumptions, glances that carried stories she hadn't told. But this time, something inside her was quieter.
No tangri, no tachamed. Just résolute.
Finally, a man in a sleek navy suit approached her. He wasn't a waiter. He wore a name tag that read Richard Lang, manager. "Good evening, ma'am," he said with a practiced smile.
I'm the floor manager.
"I wanted to check in. Some of our guests have expressed discomfort." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes calm but clear. "Discomfort?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then pressed on. "They're concerned that perhaps you may not be aware of the nature of our establishment. This is a fine dining experience with premium pricing. We simply want to ensure our guests are comfortable and prepared." Margaret folded her hands over the menu. "And you think I'm not?" she asked. He faltered for the first time. "No, of course not. We're simply looking out for everyone's experience. She nodded slowly. Is that so? He didn't respond. At that moment, a woman at a nearby table laughed loudly. Maybe she's waiting for someone to pay for her. Another voice chimed in, bet she's here for the free air conditioning. Laughter rippled again, sharper this time. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small older model cell phone. She dialed a number and waited. Jonathan, she said when it connected. Could you stop by the Elysian? I believe it's time. She ended the call and returned the phone to her pocket. The manager stared at her, unsure how to respond. Margaret leaned back slightly, looking at him once more. You can continue doing your job, Mr. Lang, she said. I've done mine for many years. I know what judgment looks like. She returned to the menu. Outside the restaurant, the sky had begun to shift toward twilight. Inside, a story was beginning, one the guests would remember long after the plates were cleared. 20 minutes passed. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. It wasn't just the woman in the gray coat anymore, it was the anticipation. Whispers traveled from table to table. Some were curious, others entertained, and a few outright smug. She called someone, one man muttered. Bet it's her son. Probably going to pay for her dinner. Or drive her home to the shelter, someone added, barely suppressing laughter. Margaret remained in her seat, still and silent. She had closed the menu and placed it neatly on the table. Her hands rested on her lap. There was no emotion on her face, just a quiet, unwavering calm that unsettled some more than rage ever could. Then, the front doors opened. He walked in with a presence that could not be ignored. Tall, commanding, dressed in a tailored black suit with no tie, just the crisp white shirt underneath. His hair, dark and slicked back. His face, familiar. More than one person recognized him instantly. Is that
Jonathan Hill.
No way.
The Jonathan Hill.
Whispers turned into gasps.
Fork posed midair.
Phones were subtly lifted under napkins, cameras silently recording. Jonathan Hill, founder and CEO of Hill Tech Industries, one of the most influential figures in Silicon Valley, a name synonymous with innovation and power, was now standing inside the Elysian. He didn't scan the room. He walked straight, confidently, to the back corner, toward the gray coat. Mom, he said, his voice deep and steady. Margaret looked up at him and smiled faintly.
Hello, dear.
He bent down and kissed her on the forehead. Then he turned slowly, deliberately, to face the room.
Silence.
Eyes darted. Faces flushed. Someone dropped a spoon. The hostess from earlier turned pale, her hands trembling behind the podium. The manager, Richard Lang, had frozen in place near the wine display. Jonathan's gaze found him. You're the manager here, he asked, voice calm but unmistakably authoritative.
Yes, Monsieur Hill.
Richard Lang, he stammered. I didn't realize. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. You didn't realize this was my mother, he finished the sentence for him. Richard nodded rapidly. Yes, exactly. We didn't know. Had we known, of course, we would have. Jonathan took a step closer. If she weren't my mother, he said slowly, would that have made this treatment acceptable?
The question it lies under.
No one moved. She was ignored, mocked, seated by the service door, and judged by her coat. All in the span of 30 minutes. Is this the standard you uphold in this establishment? Richard swallowed hard. Mr. Hill, I assure you, this isn't our usual.
Jonathan reste d'onde.
I don't need assurances, he said.
I need honesty.
And I think everyone in this room needs a reminder. He turned to face the guests, now thoroughly silenced. You see a woman walk into a fine restaurant alone, wearing old clothes, and your instinct is to assume she doesn't belong. You don't ask who she is, where she's been, or what she's overcome. You just decide, based on a coat, that she is less. That she doesn't deserve respect. He turned back to the table and pulled out a chair for himself, sitting beside Margaret. My mother raised me on her own, he continued, now looking directly at the staff. She worked 3 jobs, never took a day off, and never once asked for help. The same hands you refuse to serve are the hands that built my foundation. Everything I am, I owe to her.
No one dared to speak.
Margaret, watching her son, placed a hand gently on his arm.
Jonathan, she said softly. D'être neuf.
Let them be. But he shook his head, still calm. No, Mom. This is the part they never see. They see the power, the money, the suits. But not the woman behind it all. He looked back at the manager. I want every staff member here to go home tonight and think about what it means to carry dignity. Because it's not what you wear. It's not who signs your check. It's how you treat people when you think no one is watching. Richard Lang stood frozen, mouth slightly open, unable to respond. Then slowly, Jonathan turned to the waitress who had served Margaret earlier, the one who had been reluctant to approach. I don't want apologies, he said.
You won't change.
He looked around the room once more. Let this be the last time someone is judged for not playing dress-up to earn your respect. With that, he turned to Margaret again. Would you still like to have dinner here, Mom? She smiled faintly. Yes. I believe I've worked up an appetite. Jonathan nodded. Then let's eat. The head chef was called in immediately. The general manager was summoned from home. Within minutes, a fresh table setting arrived, a special menu was offered, and the sommelier himself came over to pair wines. But Margaret declined all of it. I'll just have the roast chicken, she said simply. And water, thank you. She turned to the staff who now stood around her table with their best forced smiles and stiff backs. I didn't come here to be pampered, she said. I came to remind you that every person deserves respect, whether or not they're on your reservation list or Forbes list. And with that, she opened the menu once more, this time not as a woman being scrutinized, but as someone who had earned the room's attention, through nothing but quiet strength and enduring grace. Outside, the city lights blinked on one by one, unaware of the shift that had just occurred inside a single restaurant on a random Tuesday evening. But for those present, nothing would feel quite the same again. The next morning, the city moved with its usual rhythm. Subway trains clattered through tunnels, taxi horns pierced the air, and skyscrapers blinked to life with fluorescent urgency. But within a small circle of people, something had already shifted. The Elysian staff, still shaken from the previous evening, gathered in the break room for an emergency meeting. No one was smiling. Richard Lang, red-eyed and sleepless, stood before them holding a clipboard he wasn't reading from. This is not going away, he said quietly. You all saw who she was. But more importantly, you saw what we became.
Der was no rebutal.
Even the hostess, usually quick with sarcasm, looked down at her hands, silently wringing a paper napkin. We failed, Richard continued. Not because we didn't know her name, but because we didn't even ask. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, in a sleek high-rise overlooking the Hudson, Jonathan Hill sat in his office, reviewing a flood of emails, messages, and social media mentions. The night before, after returning home, he had written a simple post on his LinkedIn account. Yesterday, my mother was judged by the world based on the coat she wore. No one asked her name. No one saw her strength. But I saw it. I've always seen it. Every empire I built began in her hands calloused from cleaning floors and carrying groceries and comforting me when the world didn't make sense. The next time you think someone doesn't belong, I ask you, who taught you to measure worth that way? Change that. Be better. For her.
For all the heroes who go unseen.
By noon, the post had gone viral. Within hours, it was featured on news sites, retweeted by influencers, and dissected in think pieces. The photograph that accompanied it, a candid shot of Margaret sitting quietly at the Elysian, her coat neatly buttoned, eyes patient, became the face of a cultural conversation. TV pundits debated the social implications. Podcasts picked apart the psychology of perception. Lifestyle magazines called it the gray coat moment. But not all reactions were cerebral. In Boston, a college sophomore named Natalie called her grandmother to apologize for mocking her thrift store habits. In Los Angeles, a barista who had once dismissed a quiet customer for not tipping left a note the next day that read, I see you. I'm sorry I didn't before. In Seattle, a public library posted a photo of an elderly patron at their reading table with the caption, Respect isn't earned by money. It's earned by time. Back in New York, Margaret sat in her modest apartment 2 stories above a bakery. She had declined all interviews, turned down the morning show circuit, and ignored the cameras that had waited outside her building that morning. Instead, she brewed tea. Her phone buzzed with messages, some from old friends, some from people she barely remembered, many from strangers. She read one aloud, her voice soft.
My name is Tyler. I saw your story. My mom were a coat just like your.
I used to ask her to drop me off a block away from school.
I want to do that again.
She set the phone down and stared out the window at the bakery awning below. When Jonathan arrived that evening, he brought 2 takeout containers and a bottle of ginger ale. He didn't mention the internet. He didn't mention the headlines. Instead he said, I got us that sesame chicken you like. She smiled. From Lou's. Of course, he replied, setting the food on the table. Where else? They ate in near silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who didn't need to fill space with noise. After dinner, as they washed dishes side by side, Margaret finally spoke. I saw the post. Jonathan nodded. You wrote it well, she said. Simple. Honest. I meant every word. She dried her hands on a towel and looked at him. Do you think it'll last? She asked. This awareness? He hesitated. I don't know, he admitted. But maybe if it reaches just one person in a meaningful way, it's already worth something. She nodded, then walked to the bookshelf and pulled down a small leather-bound notebook. It was old, the edges fraying. She handed it to him. What's this? My story, she said. Not the viral one. The real one. I started writing it years ago, never finished. Maybe now it's time. Jonathan opened the notebook and read a line on the first page. I was 24 when I realized the world wasn't made for women like me. But I decided to live in it anyway. He looked up at her, speechless. Margaret sat back in her chair, her eyes on the ceiling. I don't want to be a symbol, she said. I don't want to be a headline. I just want people to look at one another and remember that every person has a past they didn't witness. A story they didn't hear. Jonathan nodded slowly. I'll make sure your story gets heard. Not because you need the world to know, but because the world needs to learn how to listen. That night, as the city buzzed outside and the internet hummed with commentary, the woman in the gray coat sat quietly, knowing that her silence had spoken more than most voices ever could. 3 days after the evening at the Elysian, the restaurant issued a formal public apology. It was posted on their social media accounts, published in the New York Times, and framed at the restaurant's entrance. The statement was carefully worded. We deeply regret the events that took place at our establishment on Tuesday evening. Every guest who walks through our doors deserves dignity, regardless of appearance, age, or background. We failed in that duty. The Elysian commits to undergoing comprehensive staff retraining and implementing a respect-first policy, effective immediately. We thank Mrs. Margaret Hill and her son, Mr. Jonathan Hill, for reminding us what truly defines excellence. The apology trended for a day. But what lingered was not the corporate statement. What lingered was the image of Margaret Hill, gray coat, gentle posture, eyes steady, circulating across the internet, printed on posters in college classrooms, quoted in sermons, and used as the opening slide in corporate ethics trainings. The incident had touched something raw and familiar. Because everyone, at some point, had judged or been judged. Everyone had looked past someone in a hurry or dismissed a stranger based on what they wore or how they spoke. And now, collectively, a mirror was being held up. On a quiet street in Brooklyn, a middle school teacher named Maria Santos asked her students to write essays titled The Person I Overlooked. Some wrote about janitors. Others about grandparents. One boy wrote about his mother, who worked 2 jobs and never attended parent meetings, not because she didn't care, but because she couldn't read English. In Chicago, a local diner posted a sign above the register, "Every coat tells a story. Treat each one with kindness." And in New York, Jonathan Hill received a letter, not through his PR team or corporate email, but handwritten, in a stamped envelope. It read, "Dear Mr. Hill, my name is Thomas Riley. I'm 62. I've been homeless for 3 years. Last week, I was turned away from 3 places because I looked disruptive. I never raised my voice. I never caused harm. I was just tired. Then I saw your post about your mom. And I cried. Not because it was sad, but because someone finally said what we all feel. That worth has nothing to do with how you look. Thank you for seeing her. For seeing all of us. Jonathan read the letter 3 times. He didn't cry. He didn't post it online. Instead, he placed it in a folder labeled simply, Truth. A week later, Margaret received an invitation in the mail. It was from Columbia University's School of Social Work, inviting her to speak on a panel titled Dignity in the Everyday. She declined. Instead, she wrote a handwritten note. Thank you for the invitation. I am honored. But my voice is not louder than anyone else's. If you truly wish to discuss dignity, let others speak. Invite the bus driver, the nurse, the grandmother who volunteers at the library. They have more to say than I ever will. With gratitude, Margaret Hill. Meanwhile, Jonathan had an idea. It came not from his marketing team, but during a quiet moment in his kitchen, staring at the same gray coat draped over the back of a chair. He founded the Gray Coat Initiative. It wasn't flashy.
No celebrity endorsements.
No ad campaigns.
Just one mission, to remind people that dignity is a human right, not a luxury. The initiative's first program was called 1 Hour, 1 Story. Volunteers across the country would spend 1 hour per week listening to someone over 60 share a memory.
No interviews.
No recording. Just listening. By the end of the first month, over 4,000 volunteers had signed up. Libraries, churches, community centers, even coffee shops hosted these story hours. Some brought tea. Some brought notebooks. Some just brought attention. And the stories came. About love lost and found. About wars survived. About children raised and dreams deferred. About everyday triumphs no one ever noticed, except now, they were being heard. At one such gathering in Queens, a young woman named Lily sat across from an 85-year-old man named Reggie who had once been a shoemaker. He told her about the day he crafted shoes for a woman on her wedding day who couldn't afford a new pair. He never charged her. 40 years later, her son returned to thank him. I never forgot what you did for my mother, the son had said. She danced all night without pain. Lily wept. At another session in Denver, a former librarian shared how she used to tuck encouraging notes into books borrowed by struggling students. Decades later, one of those students became a professor and found her to thank her. These were the quiet legacies, now echoing through cities. Jonathan visited one such session unannounced, sitting silently in the back. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't speak. He just listened. When it ended, an older woman approached him and said, "You look like that man. The one on the news." "I get that sometimes," he smiled. She nodded. "Well, whoever you are, thanks for this. People like me, we fade. It's nice to be remembered before we're gone." He walked home that night, thinking not about business or legacy, but about silence, and how often the world fills it with assumptions, when it could just listen. Back at Margaret's apartment, she was preparing dinner. Nothing elaborate. Just soup and bread. When Jonathan arrived, she handed him a bowl and gestured to the table. "I heard about your program," she said as they sat. "I thought you didn't watch the news," he replied. "I don't," she smiled. "But word travels." He chuckled. "It's simple. People talk. Others listen." She stirred her soup thoughtfully. "Funny," she said, "that it took all this for people to realize the power of a conversation." He looked at her. "It started with one coat," he said. She looked back, unflinching.
No.
"It started with one assumption." And in that moment, the truth was clear. It wasn't just a gray coat that changed the city. It was the quiet refusal to disappear. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft ticking of a wall clock and the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath Margaret's slippers. A faint breeze fluttered the curtains, and light spilled onto the worn photo albums spread across the coffee table. Jonathan had arrived early that evening, unannounced. He didn't knock. He never had to. The door was never locked when she was home. "Soup again?" he asked, gently closing the door behind him. "It's a good night for it," Margaret said from the kitchen. "Besides, you never used to complain about my lentil soup." "I was a hungry kid," he replied. "I ate anything." "Exactly," she smiled. He set his briefcase down, loosened his collar, and walked over to the living room where the photo albums were open. He picked one up and flipped through a few pages, black and white snapshots, faded with time but rich with stories. In one, Margaret stood in front of a diner, her hair tied back, apron around her waist, holding a plate of food. Her smile was small but genuine. "I haven't seen this one," he said, holding it up. "That was 1978, she said, walking over with 2 bowls of soup. "Rosie's Diner. Brooklyn. I worked the early shift 6 days a week. Sundays off if the manager felt generous." Jonathan set the photo down, studying his mother. "You never really told me much about those years," he said. Margaret sat beside him, hands wrapped around the warm bowl. "There wasn't much to tell," she said. "Just a woman working. Trying not to fall apart." He looked at her, eyes soft. "Tell me anyway." And so she did. She told him about growing up in Ohio, the youngest of 5 children, and the first to leave home. How she moved to New York at 23 with nothing but a suitcase and a dream of becoming a teacher. But dreams, she said, don't always pay rent. She told him about the small studio she rented above a hardware store, where the radiator hissed all night and the ceiling leaked when it rained. She worked as a receptionist, then as a waitress, then as a cleaner, sometimes all in the same week. She met his father at a church gathering. He was charming, handsome, and left 6 months after Jonathan was born. He left a note and nothing else. "I wasn't angry," she said. "I was too busy surviving." She spoke of long nights and cold winters, of pushing a stroller down ice-covered sidewalks, counting quarters for laundry, and keeping books from the library a few days longer because she couldn't afford the overdue fee. Jonathan listened in silence, his soup growing cold. "I never knew how hard it was," he said finally. "I didn't want you to," she replied. "That was the whole point." He stared at her, the woman who had never once complained, never once asked for thanks. "You should have told me." Margaret shook her head gently. "You thanked me every time you got up and kept going," she said. "Every time you studied, every time you held the door for someone, every time you treated someone with kindness. That's how children thank their parents, not with words, but with the people they become." Jonathan blinked against the tears forming behind his eyes. Margaret reached for another album, flipping it open to a picture of him in his graduation cap and gown. "That was the proudest day of my life," she said. "You looked exhausted," he said with a smile. "I was," she laughed. "I worked an overnight shift before the ceremony. But I wouldn't have missed it for the world." He ran his fingers over the image. "Why didn't you sit with the other parents?" he asked, remembering her sitting alone in the back row. "I didn't want to take a seat from someone else," she said simply. "Besides, I could see you just fine." He didn't know what to say. For a moment, neither did she. Then she continued, her voice lower now. "There were days I wanted to give up," she said. "Days when everything felt too heavy. But then I'd come home and see you sleeping, with your little fists tucked under your chin. And I'd remember that quitting wasn't an option." Jonathan looked at her, truly looked. It wasn't just the gray coat or the worn hands or the quiet smile. It was everything she had carried that he had never seen. Every scar, every disappointment, every sacrifice wrapped in silence. "You were never just surviving," he said. "You were building something. You were building me." She smiled softly. "I was building us." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I wish I could go back," he said. "And sit beside you in that leaky apartment. Or carry groceries up those stairs. Or just listen." She squeezed his hand. "You're here now," she said. "That's enough." They sat in silence for a long time, hands clasped, photo albums between them, and the sound of the city rising and falling beyond the window. Outside, the world was changing. But inside that small apartment, one truth remained. Dignity doesn't begin with a title or end with a paycheck. It begins with a choice. A choice to keep going. To stay kind. To carry love even when no one is watching. And in the woman who once stood behind counters and beneath ceilings that leaked, in the mother who had given everything so quietly, Jonathan now saw the clearest reflection of greatness he had ever known. By the 3rd week, Margaret's story had become something else, something no longer fully hers. Magazines ran cover pieces titled The Grace of Margaret, and America's Quiet Hero. Influencers created tribute videos, narrating her words over slow piano music. An apparel brand released a limited edition gray coat called The Hill, pledging 10% of proceeds to dignity-related causes. Margaret saw none of it firsthand. She didn't use social media. She didn't read digital magazines. But her mailbox overflowed with letters. The phone rang constantly. A production company left a bouquet of lilies and a handwritten note on her doorstep. We believe your story would make a beautiful limited series. Let us help the world hear your voice. She placed the letter in a drawer and said nothing. But Jonathan saw it all. And it worried him. What began as a powerful moment of truth was slowly being diluted, turned into a brand, a product, a sentiment packaged for consumption. He walked into a bookstore one afternoon and saw a display table labeled, "Inspired by Margaret." There were novels about working-class resilience, guides to minimalism, even a memoir written by someone claiming to have once stood in line behind her at a bank. He stood there, unmoving, as people browsed and chuckled and added books to their baskets. None of them knew her. He left without saying a word. That evening, he found her in the kitchen chopping carrots. "You're everywhere," he said. Margaret looked up. "Am I?" "There's a clothing line. A podcast. Someone published a book saying you taught them how to bake banana bread in 1993.
She looked softly. He ate banana bread.
Jonathan didn't laugh. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "It's getting out of hand." Margaret placed the knife down and wiped her hands. "Let them have their moment," she said.
It won't last.
"But it should," he argued.
Not the fame.
"The lesson." She walked to the sink and turned on the water. "Fame distorts the lesson," she said. "It makes people look at the person, not the principle."
Jonathan hesitated. "So you want it all to fade. You want people to live better, not talk about me living better."
He watched her for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and opened his notes app. "Can I read you something?" he asked. "Of course." He cleared his throat. "It's something I've been working on."
A speech, maybe.
"Or an article. I'm not sure yet." She nodded. He began reading. "We don't need more icons. We need more empathy. We don't need another symbol. We need another moment, where someone chooses to pause, look again, and treat the person in front of them with humanity. My mother never asked for attention. She asked for bread to be served, water to be poured, and eyes to meet hers without suspicion. She received silence instead. But she gave grace. And now that the world has noticed, I ask only this: don't remember her name. Remember what you felt when you saw her sitting alone. And carry that feeling into your next interaction." He looked up. "Too much." Margaret's eyes glistened, but she didn't blink them away. "It's exactly right," she said. He saved the file and slid the phone back into his pocket. "I've been thinking," she said after a moment, "about something I want to do." Jonathan raised an eyebrow.
"What is that?"
"I want to go back to the Elysian," she said.
Not for revenge. Not for performance.
Just to sit. And to look. To look at what? At them, she said. At the people who looked through me.
Jonathan Wasquier.
"They'll recognize you now," he said. She nodded. "That's not the point. I want them to see what they missed the first time." The following Friday evening, Margaret arrived at the Elysian. She wore the same grey coat. But this time, the maitre d' recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Hill," he said, stepping forward with visible nervousness.
"Welcome back.
"We've prepared a table, center room, near the grand piano." Margaret smiled. "Thank you, but I'd like the one near the service door." He blinked. "That table is, well, it's hardly." "I'll take it," she said gently. She was seated promptly.
The wet stuff over.
Water appeared before she asked. Bread arrived warm. A handwritten note from the chef was tucked into the menu. She ignored it all. Instead, she looked around. Slowly, intentionally. She met the eyes of guests who had seen the viral posts. Some smiled. Some looked away, ashamed. Others whispered and pointed. She didn't flinch. She simply ate. When the meal was finished, she stood, buttoned her coat, and walked toward the exit. Richard Lang, the manager, approached. "Mrs. Hill," he said, bowing his head. "I want to personally apologize again."
For everything.
She looked at him. "Do you regret what happened?" she asked. Yes, he said immediately. Because of who I am? She asked. Or because of what you did? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. She nodded once, then walked past him. As she reached the door, she turned briefly. Regret is a good start, she said. But respect is what you choose next. And then she was gone. Back on the sidewalk, the evening air was crisp.
The lights of Manhattan glittered like distant stars. Margaret stood still for a moment, breathing it all in.
Jonathan was waiting at the corner. Well, he asked. She smiled. I saw them, she said. And this time they saw me. In classrooms across the country, Margaret Hill's story had found its way into syllabi. Professors of ethics, sociology, and journalism used her experience as a case study. High school teachers assigned essays asking students to reflect on the values of dignity and perception. At Midtown High School in Manhattan, Ms. Cho, a social studies teacher known for her quiet intensity, wheeled in a TV cart one morning and played the now viral clip of Jonathan Hill's quiet but piercing speech at the Elysian. Her students, mostly 15 and 16-year-olds, were used to media outrage. They had grown up in a world of trending topics and 30-second moral judgments. But this was different. It's just a coat, one student said softly after the clip ended. But it wasn't. No, Ms. Cho replied. It wasn't. Why not? A hand went up in the back. Because the coat was a shortcut. It let people skip the work of actually seeing her. Heads nodded. Let's talk about that, Ms. Cho said. How often do we use shortcuts when we look at someone? For the next 40 minutes, the room pulsed with quiet confessions. A student admitted she had ignored a neighbor for years because she assumed he was weird. Another confessed to laughing at a woman in worn shoes on the subway. No one was immune. But no one was mocking, either. Later that week, Ms. Cho wrote Margaret a letter. She didn't expect a response. But a week later, a simple envelope arrived. Ms. Cho opened it in her classroom after school.
Dear Ms. Cho.
Thank you for your letter. I've never considered myself a teacher, but I suppose we all are in moments we don't expect. Tell your students this. Seeing someone truly means asking, not assuming. And asking takes courage. We live in a fast world. But dignity lives in the pause. With gratitude. Margaret Hill. Ms. Cho framed the note and placed it near the door, where students passed it every day. Meanwhile, online discourse continued. While many applauded the story, others questioned its impact. One viral post read, "It's inspiring, sure, but it shouldn't take someone being the mother of a billionaire to earn respect. What if she were just a woman in a coat? Would anyone care?" The post ignited debate. Some agreed. She's being honored because of who her son is, not who she is. Others pushed back. The point is that everyone deserves respect. That's what Jonathan said. That's what she showed. The conversation spread to news panels and dinner tables. It became more than just a story. It became a question. What does it take to be seen? At Columbia University, during a campus forum on digital storytelling, a sophomore named Caleb stood during the Q&A and asked the panelists, "Do we only elevate the quiet and kind when they're connected to power?" There was a long pause. No one had a clean answer. Later that night, Caleb wrote an op-ed for the campus paper titled Visibility and the Value of Voices. In it he wrote, "Margaret Hill didn't want the spotlight. But it found her. The danger is not in celebrating her, it's in forgetting that others like her walk among us daily, unrecognized, unacknowledged, unheard. If we walk away from this moment only remembering her name and not her message, we've learned nothing." The op-ed was shared thousands of times. And somewhere in her quiet apartment above the bakery, Margaret read it. She closed the laptop and sat for a long time, her tea growing cold. Jonathan came by later that evening. He found her at the window, staring out at the city lights. "Something on your mind?" he asked. She turned, then gestured for him to sit. "You were right," she said. "About what?" "About the spotlight. It changes the shape of things." He sat beside her. "It's hard to control once it starts." She looked down at her hands. "I don't regret what happened," she said. "But I worry that people are chasing the story, not the meaning." Jonathan nodded. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing. She turned to him. Then what do we do? He was quiet for a moment, then replied, we go back to the beginning. To the restaurant? No, he said. To the silence. To the simple, human moments. One-on-one.
No cameras. No headlines.
She looked at him. You mean the initiative? He nodded. Yes. But more than that. I've started a fund. Quietly. It will support storytelling projects, not viral campaigns, not speeches, but real person-to-person stories. In community centers. In classrooms. In homes. Margaret raised an eyebrow. And who will tell these stories? He smiled. The people who've lived them. Like you. She chuckled. You think I'm going on a tour? No, he said. I think you've already done enough. But others can carry the torch. She looked out the window again. It's strange, she said. All my life I felt invisible. And now that people see me, I realize I was never truly alone. Jonathan placed a hand over hers. You weren't. And now, neither are they. That night, as he left, he passed by a young woman sitting on the bakery steps, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, hesitated, then asked, Are you Jonathan Hill? He nodded. Is your mom really like they say? He paused. She's quieter, he said. And stronger. The young woman nodded. She reminds me of my grandma. Jonathan smiled. Then your grandma must be extraordinary. As he walked away, she opened her phone again and deleted the half-written tweet she was about to post. Instead, she looked up at the stars peeking through the city haze and whispered to herself, I should call her. Back upstairs, Margaret sat alone, but not lonely. Outside, a generation was beginning to remember what their parents and grandparents had tried to teach them all along. That real change doesn't come in the form of applause or headlines. It comes quietly, in the way we choose to look at one another, and in what we do next. It was a Wednesday morning, gray and quiet, the kind Margaret liked best. She was trimming her small potted plant near the windowsill when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, a courier handed her a cream-colored envelope sealed with an official crest. He tipped his hat and disappeared down the hallway without a word. Margaret closed the door slowly and turned the envelope in her hands. The seal was unfamiliar, simple, embossed with a torch and olive branch. She broke it open. Inside was a formal invitation. The Office of the President of the United States. Mrs. Margaret Hill. On behalf of the President and First Lady, we respectfully invite you to be the guest of honor at the National Forum on Human Dignity and Civic Integrity, to be held next month at the Capitol. Your story has moved a nation. We would be honored if you would share your thoughts on the meaning of dignity in everyday life. Warm regards. Office of Public Engagement. She read it 3 times. Then she placed it on the kitchen table, sat down, and stared at it for a long while. When Jonathan arrived later that day, she didn't greet him with her usual warmth. Instead, she handed him the invitation in silence. He read it carefully, then looked up. They want you to speak? She nodded. He smiled. That's incredible. It's absurd, she said. Jonathan blinked. What? I'm not a speaker, she said. I'm not a leader. I didn't do anything extraordinary. You did, he said. You lived with quiet dignity when no one was watching. You made them watch. She shook her head. And now they want to put me on a stage. Dress me up. Make me a symbol. A lesson to be studied. Jonathan sat beside her. Is that such a bad thing? She looked at him, eyes steady. It depends on what they really want. A message or a moment. A woman or an image. He was silent. I've spent my whole life being invisible, she continued. Now that they see me, I don't want to become someone else for their comfort. You wouldn't be, he said. You'd be helping others see themselves. In your words. In your truth. Margaret tapped her fingers on the edge of the table. I don't like the idea of standing behind a podium, she said. I never liked crowds. Jonathan smiled faintly. But they need you. She looked at the envelope again. They need what I represent. Not who I am. He leaned forward. Maybe. But maybe it's time to redefine what representation looks like. She glanced at him, curious. You said you weren't a leader. But look around, Mom. People are listening. They're writing essays, making policies, rethinking their lives. Because of you. Margaret exhaled. I just wanted dinner. Jonathan laughed. And you got it. With an audience of millions. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then Margaret said, almost to herself, if I say yes, I don't want to be told what to wear or what to say. Jonathan nodded. Then don't let them. She stood and walked to the window, the late afternoon sun casting soft shadows across the floor. I'm 73, she said. I've lived long enough to know how these things go. They'll want sound bites. They'll want sentimentality. Then surprise them, Jonathan said. She turned. How? Be exactly who you are. Nothing more. Nothing less. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She sat at the table long after Jonathan left, the invitation still resting in front of her. She thought of her younger self, scrubbing floors, counting coins, kissing Jonathan's forehead in the dark. She thought of the night at the Elysian. The silence. The shame. The way her son had stood beside her, unwavering. She thought of the girl on the bakery steps, the teacher's letter, the boy who wrote about his mother's coat. And she realized something. This wasn't about attention. It was about permission. Permission to be visible. To be heard. To allow others like her to stop apologizing for being ordinary in a world that only noticed the extraordinary. The next morning, she called the number on the invitation. A polite assistant answered and confirmed her RSVP. Yes, Margaret said. I'll attend. There was a pause. And will you be submitting your remarks in advance? The assistant asked. No, she said. I see. Would you like assistance preparing a draft? No, she said again. I already know what I want to say. Later that week, she pulled out the small leather notebook she had once handed to Jonathan. The one where she had started her story but never finished it. She flipped to the last empty page and wrote a single sentence. Sometimes dignity means stepping into the light, not to be seen, but so others know they can too. Then she closed the book and exhaled. Across the city, preparations began. News outlets received whispers about her attendance. The White House press secretary confirmed the forum's agenda and highlighted Margaret Hill's speech as a centerpiece of the national dialogue on human worth. Speculation grew. Fashion houses offered to design her outfit. Journalists begged for interviews. A book deal was proposed. She declined them all. I have one thing to say, she told Jonathan. And I'll say it my way. The day drew closer. But Margaret wasn't nervous. She was ready. Not to perform. Not to please. But to remind the world of what it had forgotten. That greatness doesn't wear crowns. Sometimes, it wears a grey coat. The marble steps of the Capitol glowed gold in the morning light. Inside, the National Forum on Human Dignity and Civic Integrity was already underway. Flags lined the chamber walls. Journalists, lawmakers, educators, and community leaders filled the tiered seats, murmuring in anticipation. The energy was unlike anything Margaret had experienced before. She sat in the green room, a small waiting area tucked behind thick double doors. There was water on the table, untouched. A mirror leaned against the wall, but she hadn't looked into it. She knew how she looked. Grey coat.
No makeup.
Worn shoes. Exactly as she intended. Jonathan was beside her, pacing slightly, then stopping, then pacing again. You don't have to do this, you know, he said, not for the first time. Margaret looked up. But I want to. He smiled, though there was worry in his eyes. You sure you're ready? I've been ready for 73 years, she said. There was a knock at the door. A young staffer entered with a headset and a clipboard. Mrs. Hill, she said nervously. They're ready for you. Margaret stood. Her knees ached slightly. Her hands were steady. She walked slowly behind the staffer, down a corridor lined with portraits of historical figures. Names she recognized. Names taught in schoolbooks. Names she never thought hers would appear beside. As the doors opened, the crowd inside turned toward her. A few rose to their feet instinctively. Others followed. Soon the entire chamber stood in quiet recognition. Margaret did not wave. She did not smile. She walked to the podium, gripped its edges, and waited. When the room finally settled, she leaned toward the microphone. "Good morning," she said simply. Her voice, though not loud, filled the space. "I was told I should prepare a speech. That I should write down what I want to say and have it reviewed. But I've lived my whole life preparing to speak, and rarely being invited to do so. So today, I'm going to say what I've been waiting to say for years." She paused.
I'm not a leader.
"I'm not a scholar. I've never run a company or held public office. I've worked behind counters and scrubbed floors. I raised a child alone and stretched single paychecks to cover two mouths." A few murmurs in the crowd. "Some of you call what happened to me a moment of awakening." But that moment wasn't new. It just finally became inconvenient enough for others to notice. Silence settled. "You see, dignity isn't a policy. It's not a speech. It's not something we debate until cameras turn off. Dignity is quiet. It happens in the glance you choose to offer, in the tone you decide to take. It's the difference between asking a question and making an assumption." She looked down briefly, gathering breath. "I was overlooked. And then I was glorified. And both made me feel like a stranger to myself. Because I didn't need a pedestal. I just needed a place." One person in the audience clapped, tentative, unsure. Then another. But Margaret raised her hand gently, and the applause stopped. "I'm not here for applause," she said. "I'm here to ask a question." She leaned forward.
Où dost overlook? The warden in the air like smoke. Is it the janitor in your office?
The woman who checks your groceries?
The man who drive your bus? Or is it someone closer, your mother, your grandfather, your neighbor who lives alone? She scanned the room slowly.
We don't fail as a society because we lack intelligence. We fail because we stop seeing each other. And when we stop seeing, we stop caring.
And when we stop caring, we justify anything.
There was no movement now. No sound. Only breath and thought. "You want to change the world?" she asked. "Then change your habits.
Note your hashtag.
Ask the name of the person who serves your food. Look people in the eye. Speak slowly to those who need time.
Give space for silence.
That's where dignity lives." She paused again, hands still on the podium.
I'm not a hero. I'm not a story.
"I'm a woman who asked for a meal. And what I received was a mirror, held up to all of us." Then she closed her notes, though she hadn't used them, and gave the smallest of nods. "Thank you for listening." She stepped away from the microphone.
The silence stretched.
Not in discomfort, but in reverence. Then the room stood.
Not in polite obligation.
But in truth. A standing ovation, not for drama, not for performance, but for conviction. Backstage, Jonathan waited, eyes rimmed with emotion. As Margaret returned, he opened his arms, but she shook her head and pulled him into a firm, quiet hug. "That," he whispered, "was the most powerful thing I've ever seen." She leaned back just enough to meet his eyes. "It wasn't power," she said. "It was honesty." As they exited the building, a journalist called out, "Mrs. Hill, do you have a message for young people?" Margaret turned, just for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you your voice doesn't matter, especially the voice inside your own head." And with that, she stepped into the afternoon sun. There were no bodyguards. No flashing cameras. Just a mother and her son, walking down the Capitol steps, quietly together. No one noticed the coat she wore. And that, perhaps, was the greatest sign of change. It had been 2 weeks since Margaret's speech at the Capitol. The headlines lingered for a few days: "The woman who humbled a nation," "Gray coat," "Golden words," "A mother's voice that moved Washington." But as expected, the spotlight eventually dimmed. Another controversy took its place.
Another crisis. Another distraction.
Margaret didn't mind. She had never spoken to be remembered. She had spoken so others might begin to listen, to themselves, to each other. Her life returned to its quiet rhythm.
Morning tea by the window.
A visit to the corner grocer. Walking slowly through the park as leaves turned their early amber. She received fewer calls now. Fewer letters. Most of the cameras had moved on. But something had changed. Not in the volume of her days, but in their substance. Strangers greeted her with gentleness. A barista at the cafe refused her money one morning, placing a coffee on the counter with a simple, "Thank you for making people think." A young man on the subway offered her his seat, then sat beside her and said, "I called my mom last week." She cried. Margaret smiled at each moment, not out of pride, but recognition. These were the ripples. One evening, she was invited to speak, not to politicians or journalists, but to a group of high school seniors in a modest auditorium uptown. She agreed quietly, with a condition: no cameras, no press, no introductions. When she arrived, the room was half full, students slouched in their chairs, some scrolling on their phones. Margaret stepped to the front of the room, adjusted the microphone, and looked at them. "You don't know me," she said. "That's okay. You don't need to." Some heads lifted. The scrolling slowed. "I'm not here to impress you," she continued.
I'm not here to tell you how to live.
"I just want to ask you a question." She looked slowly around the room. "Who in your life do you walk past without really seeing?" A silence settled.
Is it your parent?
A sibling? A friend who always says they're fine, but never looks it? Is it the janitor you've never spoken to?
Or the classmate who eat lunch alone?
No one answered. She didn't expect them to. "I ask because I've been that person," she said.
Invisible.
Assumed. Misread. A girl in the front row slowly lowered her phone.
A boy in the back sat up straighter.
"And it's not about being famous," Margaret said. "It's about being real. And the truth is, we all carry something.
Some carry burden in silence.
Some carry pride that hides pain. And some," she paused, "carry the belief that they don't matter." She stepped away from the mic for a moment, then back again. "I came here today because if even one of you decides to see a little more clearly, listen a little more kindly, speak a little more truthfully, then maybe that's how the world changes." She gave a soft nod. Not in speeches. Not in slogans. But in how we treat each other when no one's watching. When she left, the auditorium remained quiet. That night, the principal emailed her a note from one of the students. "I didn't think I'd care. But I haven't stopped thinking about what she said. Tomorrow, I'm going to apologize to someone I've ignored. And maybe that's where I'll start."
Margaret read it twice.
She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Some weeks later, autumn arrived in full. One morning, Jonathan came to visit, carrying a box. "Something for you," he said, placing it on the kitchen table. Margaret raised an eyebrow. He opened it carefully and revealed a small brass plaque. It was simple.
Elegant. What is this?
"They've renamed the community library downtown," he said. "After you." Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "Why would they do that?" He smiled. "Because they want people to remember what dignity looks like." She stared at the plaque for a long time. Then she said, "I hope they remember what it feels like more than what it looks like." Jonathan nodded. "They will." She ran a finger across the engraving.
The Margaret in librairie. A space for everyone.
A place to be seen.
She exhaled slowly.
"Let's not make a big thing of it," she said.
No ribbon cutting.
No stage. "Just books?" he asked. "Just people," she said. Later that afternoon, she walked past the bakery where she used to sit unnoticed. A teenager outside held the door for her and smiled. "Nice coat," he said. She smiled back. "Thanks. It's been with me a long time." As she walked home, wind rustled the leaves overhead. Children laughed in the distance. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm. But Margaret knew something had shifted.
Not the world.
But the eyes of those who lived in it. She reached her apartment, opened the door, and placed the plaque gently on the shelf beside a photo of Jonathan in his graduation gown. She sat down at the window. Same tea. Same light. But no longer the same silence. It had been broken. And through that opening, a new kind of attention had entered, one not fueled by spectacle, but rooted in humanity. She wasn't a headline anymore. She was what she had always been. A woman in a gray coat. Seen. Respected. remembered. Not for her struggle, but for her grace.